So, yes, I think I've been over the generations thing before, but I haven't been over who exactly thought of it. I thought it might be funny. This tape is almost used up. Someone used it up. Well, it's not a tape, but it's a thing. So, millennial thing. Okay, so there's some confusion as to where all of this came from. Apparently, the whole Generation X thing generates from a man named Robert Capa, who was a photographer who took pictures of various generation groups in the 80s and apparently coined the phrase Generation X. He's the guy that coined the phrase Generation X. Or at least colloquially coined the phrase Generation X. There are various other versions of that, and basically it's because he wanted to write a book about baby boomers, those born after World War II. That would have been the 1940s. And so he decided, hey, I'm going to do, I'm going to write about baby boomers. And so he thought, well, what would the generation after that be, and when would that start? So he kicked the can ahead about 20 years to the mid-60s and said, okay, that's where Generation X would start. The generation just after the war, the age of prosperity, that kind of thing. The beginning of those people after that. So baby boomers, well, long story short, baby boomers were born after World War II up to the 60s. So they are the early 60s, like 64, 65. It's a little fuzzy though. It is not. It is a colloquial language thing based on pop culture. So it is not set in stone. What those Wikipedia pages say. It is not set in stone because it's very fluid. Everyone's nobody can say I was born here or I was born there, or there's no way to box in that group so much. They have with the last 20 years, but they really shouldn't have, because it really is a generation means about 18 years, 18 to 20 years. That's a generation. You can't have a generation where it's half a generation, where they're born, where they would literally have been 11 when they had children. No, that's not how that works. So that's not really what they're talking about. So you have the millennials crashing right into the other generation. So they're going like X, Y, and Z because it's like an alphabet, although it really wasn't. The X generation, older sibling, the X generation, half siblings are baby boomers. That went from, they're further back 20 years, so, or more. But I'm not an expert on that, obviously. So, but yeah, anybody born after about 1982 to 86 would technically be a millennial, even though that is kind of kooky, because the millennials, according to Mr. Capa, end before the millennium even happens. So in order, because apparently they want to cut it off at 16 years and not 20. They shouldn't. They should say, no, the millennials end at the millennium. They end in 2000, roughly. That would make sense. And then you'd have, okay, everybody after 2000 is not millennium. But two of my relatives, two of my niece and nephew, consider themselves of the generation after the millennials, the Generation Z, the generation after the millennials. One of them is, technically, by my brother. The other one is not. But okay. All right, fine. But because pop culture changes, because you could say that Mr. Capa here, that he didn't put into account California generations and Bay Area generations and generations that are made up of characters that have done different things, basically. They didn't put that into account. But a more standardized version of it should be that millennials end at the millennium, and then you're on to the next one. But they don't. They consider themselves Y and Z, and go on from there. So they consider themselves Y and Z. Generation Y is only 15 years, 16 years? No! Generation Y went on a little longer than that. By other Generation Y people that are probably after 1997 would probably say, hey, no, wait, I'm also Generation Y. I'm not a millennial. You know, but some of them wouldn't. They would say, "No, I am a millennial." So, yeah. Anyway, so then you have of course you have Generation Z after the millennium, the generation, which you can still throw in there just to make it clarified. I just do it every 20 years. Some people other than me have done that. I did that too. It said that that's the case. So that means, what are post-millennials? That means what's Generation Z A. Post-millennials, those born after 2000 and up to 2020, should be considered roughly, but not by his admission. By his admission, 2020 should be Alpha generation after Generation Z, even though technically, yeah, Generation Z. So after Generation Z. So Generation Z gets a short shift. Generation Z is only 11 years. For some reason, it's 11 years. 11, 12 years. That's it. You only get 12 years, Generation Z. That's it. The why me people took over half of your generation and said, no, it's ours, it's ours. And then the other one, Generation Z decided, no, we want some of yours too. So they took 5 years of yours off on the other end of the millennial end. That should have. Yeah, 2000 should have been the end of the beginning of the generation after the millennium. The post-millennials should have been after the millennium. That's where they should be, but they're not. So 2002 to 2020 is a mixture of Generation Z and Generation Alpha. And a little bit of Y thrown in there because they really, really want to be counted. They really want to be counted in that 20 years, even though, no, that's only 10 to 15 years. 1980 to 97 is 16 years, and then 97 to 2010 is 13 years. So it's only 13 years. So they only want to give Generation Z 13 years. It's messed up. And then they say, oh, they're alphas now. So wait a minute, what about Generation Z? You haven't finished it yet. It's not over. Now what's interesting is post-COVID virus pandemic, they were on the verge of a second baby boomer generation. Generation Alpha. Just to confuse everyone completely. Generation Alpha, post-2020, Generation Alpha. There you go. There's the generations. Yeah. There's and using his and two others and why does Generation Y and Z smash together so it's only 10 years for them? Well, 13 and 16 years for them. Why isn't that 20 years? Don't know. But I'm thinking that Mr. Capa was only thinking of European culture and where things evolved there, and not thinking about America at all when he wrote his little. So I'm Generation X. Nieces and nephews are Generation Z, apparently, even though they technically should be Generation Y. They're Generation Z. And apparently their children are Generation Alpha. Yeah. Okay. All right. Generation Alpha. All right. So, oh, yeah, okay. I don't think it matters all that much, really, because people will identify with what they are. They'll pick a group, they'll pick a clique. So, yeah, it doesn't matter. It's just fun. There's also some misnomers about that, in that one generation more deviant than the next. No. Don't believe that shit. I mean, come on. No. Every generation has its issues, well, whatever. That's not the case. My generation was latchkey kids come home on the bus from school, watch MTV, early cable. Back when they marketed cable as no commercials. Imagine that, cable TV with no commercials, and only a few regular channels. You have cable TV, the VCR, the DVD player, all that stuff, the internet, all that stuff. The internet is a millennial invention. X generation invention. But it was actually put together by baby boomers from the late baby boom. The hippies are a baby boomer invention. The hippies are a baby boomer invention. I'm not a baby boomer. Not at all. No, I can't be a hippie. No. I'm old enough to be a child of a hippie, but I'm not a hippie. And I wasn't. But basically, X-Gen people would be in their late 40s, early 50s now. Those in this millennial Y generation that gets a short shift there would be in their 20s now, which makes sense 30 years, 25, 30 years later. Those that are in that other generation would be children. It's only been 50 years. It doesn't, and for that group, but for the millennials, for the X-Gen up to the millennials, it's only been like 57 years, 58 years, all the way up to the end. It's only been technically two generations of, if you say 60 years, but you could say 3 and say, okay, every 20 years. It's been 3, so X, Y, and Z. But they're kind of cutting people off a little bit. Anyway, so there's my fun little rantcast on Next Generation. Yeah, so what over to you? The Transformers, the stuff like that. The fan films and stuff. Most Star Trek convention goers are several generations there too, and they kind of follow that same arc. That's why I mentioned it, is they kind of follow that same group. That Star Trek started in '66. It's very much a Generation X thing, Star Trek. However, if they were just born after that, they would have been children when it was on, but they aired it a lot. A generation should literally be a generation. It's 18 to 20 years. And he has messed up the X and Y, crushed them together, and made them in before the millennium. They should have gone a little after the millennium. Because millennial. Yeah, it's a little funky there. I don't think that originally his intent was to make it necessarily X, Y, and Z like the letters, but rather the lost generation was the 20s. But rather that's a rabbit hole. Grandma Knapp was from the lost before the lost generation. She was 100 years so before the lost generation. My parents would have been the lost generation because they were in their children. They had their children in the baby boomer era, right? So, and then beyond. So they would have been. They weren't boomers. Mom and Dad were not boomers. But my half brother and half sisters were baby boomers. They would identify as baby boomers. So they came up with most of that stuff. Well, they came up with the internet, but then we ran with it. The generation after us came up with how to use the internet, basically, in the 90s and the 2000s, because the early internet was nothing. It was really hard to use. It's a pop culture generation crossed with another one. I think that's what he was getting at. And it's really photographs that he's got. And I can't show you because they're probably copyrighted. But photographs of what the different groups looked like. And because he was a photographer originally. So he was not a sociological expert. He was a photographer taking pictures of people. By his own admission, he was not. It's interesting that social science has taken on that. I'm not either a social scientist. I took journalism and English and creative writing. But from a journalistic background, looking back on this, no, this person is a photojournalist. That's cool. But he was not technically an expert of those trends. It's cool that it became to be like that, but by his own admission, no, he just colloquialism came up with the phrase. That's neat. But yeah. So Generation Y, you're getting a short shift there. You're getting only like 12 years to, what's up with that? And then becomes Z. What does Z do? Z doesn't get to do anything. Z's gone, and then, wait a minute, Z's not even, It's only 2024, guys. We're in the middle of the alpha generation right now. But it should be the end of Generation Z. Oh, well.